Hey everyone, welcome back. So, tonight we're going to talk about socks. Yes, socks. Not battles, not revolutions, not kings beheading wives. Just foot fashion. For 2,000 years. Because why not? I hope you've dimmed the lights, maybe you're lying down, maybe you've got that one blanket you always reach for even though it's basically falling apart. This is the kind of episode where absolutely nothing exciting will happen, which is kind of the point. So, get comfortable. Wiggle your toes a little. Maybe think about the socks you're wearing right now. Congratulations, you're about to care way too much about something as boring as socks. Let's start way back. The dawn of socks. The very first sock-like things humans wore were not cute cotton ankle socks. No cheerful stripes. No little embroidered cats. Nope. They were animal skins tied around the feet with bits of sinew. Basically, caveman UGGs. Because when you live in a damp cave and the floor is essentially cold stone sprinkled with random sharp rocks, you don't want your toes exposed. The ancient Greeks, who were not exactly known for modesty in clothing, tunics, sandals, the occasional dramatic cloak toss, actually had a word for socks, pyloi, which translates to felt, because that's what they were. They would make these sad little tubes of felted animal hair, shove them inside sandals, and call it a day. Imagine walking around Athens, marble columns everywhere, philosophers debating about the nature of existence, and there's Socrates with fuzzy felt socks stuffed inside his leather sandals. A fashion statement. And yes, people absolutely wore socks with sandals, which means the internet meme war about socks and sandals being a crime against humanity is basically 2,500 years old. Humanity has always been like this. Now the Romans, as always, said, let's take something basic, give it a Latin name, and then act like we invented it. They called socks udons. These were sewn pieces of cloth, sometimes wool, wrapped around the foot. And because Romans loved hierarchy in literally everything, socks were also a way to flex wealth. A soldier on the chilly northern frontier would wear rough wool socks jammed into boots. But a senator in Rome? He'd have soft, dyed socks, maybe purple if he was really feeling rich and obnoxious. By the way, purple dye in the Roman Empire was made from crushed sea snails. Thousands of snails for one garment. So if someone was prancing around in purple socks, just remember, you're basically looking at snail juice socks. Let's drift forward to the Middle Ages. Things, as usual, got weird, because medieval Europe loved to take clothing and turn it into a social competition. Enter the hose. These weren't exactly socks, more like full-leg stockings that sometimes went all the way up to the thighs. They were usually made of wool, sometimes silk if you were rich and loved discomfort. They weren't elastic, so to keep them up, men would literally tie them to their doublets. Imagine living in the 1400s, tying your pants to your shirt with laces just so your socks don't fall down. And fashion, as always, spiraled into absurdity. Hose started out practical, but then came the trend of making one leg a different color from the other. Half red, half blue. Because apparently medieval Europe looked at socks and thought, yes, but make it clown. Also, these hose were often alarmingly tight. Like, painted on tight. If you've ever seen a medieval manuscript where a guy looks like he's strutting around in tights, he's wearing the medieval version of skinny jeans, except they're technically socks. By the Renaissance, socks became fancy. Knitting arrived in Europe around the 1500s, and suddenly socks could be stretchy. The Spanish were early adopters because of course they were. There's a story of Queen Elizabeth I being gifted her first pair of hand-knit silk stockings. She loved them so much she basically refused to wear anything else after that. So yes, the Virgin Queen had a foot fashion addiction. Royalty in general started flexing their socks. Literally. Henry VIII had a wardrobe full of expensive, custom-made hose. And considering Henry's legs got pretty chunky later in life, his tailors had quite the challenge. Imagine being the poor craftsman assigned to make socks for the world's crankiest, most inbred king. No pressure. Now, because this is a sleepy ramble, let's take a side path into the world of stinky socks. Yes, hygiene. Spoiler, people didn't wash them, or at least not often. Medieval peasants had maybe 1 or 2 pairs of hose. They wore them until they fell apart, patched them with whatever fabric they had, and kept going. Which means that the smell of the Middle Ages was probably overwhelming. Picture a crowded banquet hall. Everyone packed in, candle smoke, roasted meat, and 100 pairs of wool hose that haven't been washed since Easter. Delicious. Floating forward again. The Industrial Revolution. Yes, the great age of machines, factories, smog, and socks. Because the stocking frame knitting machine, invented in 1589 by a man named William Lee, finally made sock making faster. Fun fact, Queen Elizabeth I actually rejected Lee's machine-made stockings at first because she thought they were ugly compared to hand-knit ones. But eventually, industry won out and socks became mass-produced. By the 1800s, cotton socks were everywhere. Affordable, practical, boring, which is exactly what you want in a sock. And let's not forget the Victorians, who managed to turn everything into a moral lesson. Socks were no exception. In polite society, showing your ankles was scandalous. A glimpse of a man's sock between his trouser hem and shoe? Positively risque. Yes, there were literally etiquette manuals explaining how high socks should be pulled up, so no one had to witness the horror of a naked ankle. Meanwhile, women were stuck with stockings held up by garters. Elastic still wasn't common, so if your garter slipped, well, gravity happened. Imagine being a prim Victorian lady, fainting couch in the corner, and your stocking just slowly sags down your leg during a tea party. Society would never recover. And of course, because history is full of petty details, socks also became political. In revolutionary France, the commoners were literally called sans-culottes, meaning without breeches. But they weren't running around pantless. It just meant they wore long trousers instead of fancy knee breeches with stockings. Basically, working-class pants versus aristocratic socks. So yes, the French Revolution was partly about socks. Let's float again, gently, into the 20th century. At this point, socks were basically everywhere. Cotton, wool, silk, you name it. Soldiers in World War I and II had sock issues on a massive scale. Trench foot was literally caused by wet socks and boots. Armies would issue endless reminders. Change your socks, dry your socks, for the love of God, socks. Which means that in the middle of world wars, some poor sergeant's job was yelling at men about their socks. And then the modern era. Colorful socks, patterned socks, synthetic fabrics, tube socks in the 70s, neon socks in the 80s, ironic socks in the 2000s. You'd think we would have moved on, but no. Humanity still obsesses over socks. There are sock subscription boxes, sock fashion influencers, and yes, the eternal debate over socks and sandals, which, as we learned earlier, has literally been around since ancient Greece. And here's where we're going to pause this first stretch of our 2-hour sock odyssey. We've gone from cavemen wrapping skins around their toes to neon tube socks. And we're just warming up, because we still need to talk about silk obsession, royal sock collections, weird cultural taboos, and the tragic tale of laundry-eaten socks. So settle in, take a slow breath, wiggle your toes again, and remember, history is basically just people doing boring things for a very long time, and socks are the perfect example. Welcome back. If you're somehow still awake, congratulations. You've made it through the felt-wrapped sandals of the Greeks, the udons of the Romans, and the tight hose of medieval Europe, which means we now enter the next phase of this thrilling saga. The age when socks became fancy. Very fancy. Unnecessarily fancy. Because humans cannot leave anything alone. Let's drift into the Renaissance again. Slowly. As if we're tiptoeing into a room full of nobles who all reek of perfume, candle smoke, and questionable dental hygiene. The big invention of the period was, of course, knitting. Before knitting, socks were made of woven fabric, cut and stitched together, which was about as comfortable as wearing a burlap sack on your foot. But now, thanks to knitting needles and people with far too much free time, socks could actually stretch. Naturally, this became a status symbol. Who could afford hand-knitted silk stockings? Royals, nobles, and basically no one else. If you were poor, you still had your scratchy wool hose. If you were Elizabeth I, you got gifted silk stockings and then refused to ever go back. It was like the Tudor version of trying an iPhone once and then deciding flip phones are for peasants. Elizabeth wasn't alone in her silk obsession. Across Europe, stockings became a competitive art form. Italian merchants sold delicate silk stockings to aristocrats in France and Spain. The French, always eager to outdrama everyone, turned stockings into a fashion stage. Men wore bright colors, embroidered patterns, even gold thread. Imagine walking into Versailles in the 1600s and being blinded by someone's ankles. That was the vibe. Speaking of Versailles, Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, basically treated his legs like a national treasure. The man loved stockings. He had legs worth showing off. Slender, shapely, allegedly so nice that poets wrote verses about them. Yes, you heard that right, royal calf poetry. His stockings were embroidered, jeweled, and matched to his ridiculous shoes with buckles the size of small planets. And this was not just vanity. Stockings at court were literal politics. If you were trying to impress the king, you'd better have good legs and better stockings. Because nothing says power like silk wrapped tightly around your calves while you strut through a hall of mirrors. Now, the opposite of glamorous. Socks in early modern everyday life. Spoiler, still gross. Common people wore wool stockings that were patched and repatched until they resembled Frankenstein's monster. Washing was rare because who had time to soak, scrub, and dry wool when you were already working 14 hours in a field? So yes, the peasantry of Europe trudged around in smelly socks while kings were writing poetry about their own calves. History, as always, is an ironic split screen. Let's pause on Henry VIII again, because why not pick on Henry? His later years were a parade of medical disasters, and his legs in particular became swollen, ulcerated, and generally horrifying. Yet he still demanded custom stockings. Imagine the poor tailor tasked with wrapping silk around what was basically a rotting royal limb. No amount of embroidery was making that pretty. Transition time. Float with me now to Spain. The Habsburgs, a dynasty famous for inbreeding, tragic jaws, and an impressive ability to look miserable in portraits. They also wore stockings, of course. Charles II of Spain, sometimes called the Bewitched, spent much of his life in elaborate court dress that included stockings, despite barely being able to walk half the time. His body was failing, but you could bet his stockings were impeccable. Priorities. Now let's shuffle gently into the 18th century. The Enlightenment. Reason, science, powdered wigs, and more stockings. Men's breeches stopped at the knee, which meant stockings were not optional. If you were wealthy, you showed off your legs with silk. If you were middle class, you aimed for neat wool. And if you were poor, well, same old patched hose. It's amazing how consistent foot fashion misery has been for the lower classes. And of course, because this was the Enlightenment, people began writing about socks in essays. Philosophers who questioned the nature of existence still had opinions on proper hosiery. Because nothing screams intellectual gravitas like Rousseau complaining about garters. Speaking of garters, let's talk about the eternal struggle of keeping socks up. Elastic had not been invented, so stockings slipped. Constantly, men tied them with ribbons or garters just below the knee. Women used garters higher up, sometimes embroidered or even gifted as tokens of affection. Yes, people flirted with garters. Imagine being in 1760 and someone handing you a piece of ribbon to tie your stockings and thinking, wow, romance. Of course, garters failed all the time, which meant public humiliation. There are recorded jokes and anecdotes about stockings sliding down at inopportune moments, usually during dances. Nothing says party foul like your silk stocking sagging into a wrinkled puddle while everyone else is trying to minuet. And now, let's float gently into revolutionary times. The French Revolution once again made socks political. Sans culottes, the working men of Paris, wore trousers instead of knee breeches and stockings. This was not just fashion. It was a symbol. Breeches and stockings meant aristocracy. Pants meant equality. So in a very real way, the guillotine era was also the age of trouser supremacy. Socks went from visible to hidden, and foot fashion has never really recovered its former glory. Meanwhile, over in America, revolutionaries were also wearing stockings with breeches, but soon switched to trousers. The Founding Fathers had plenty of complaints about Britain, but they didn't forget their garters. Even George Washington, the tall, awkward farmer-turned-general, had his stockings embroidered with eagles, because subtlety was not the vibe. By the 19th century, trousers had officially won. Men's stockings vanished under pant legs. Women, however, remained trapped in the complicated world of stockings and garters. Victorian etiquette turned socks into yet another moral battleground. A lady's ankle was a scandalous sight. Imagine a foot peeking out from under yards of petticoats, and suddenly men are fanning themselves like fainting Victorians in a bad romance novel. That was the level of repression. Socks as seduction. Truly thrilling. Let's not forget the medical angle. Doctors in the 1800s began recommending special socks for circulation, warmth, and other health reasons. Wool socks were thought to prevent colds, which, considering germ theory wasn't fully understood, was basically medical superstition wrapped around your foot. But hey, at least they were cozy. And here we pause again, stretching our weary legs. We've wandered through the Renaissance silks, the political pants of the French, and the scandalous ankles of the Victorians. Socks, as it turns out, were never just socks. They were power, politics, poetry, and embarrassment, all stitched together. So take a breath. Maybe glance down at your own socks. They're probably cotton, probably elastic, probably machine-made. Luxury compared to Elizabethan hose. You are, in this one very boring way, better off than kings and queens of the past. And in our next drifting section, we'll enter the modern era. Factories, world wars, synthetic fabrics, and, yes, the eternal mystery of why washing machines eat socks. But that's for later. For now, close your eyes. Imagine a garter slipping slowly down your leg in a candlelit ballroom. Nothing dramatic. Just another boring disaster in the long history of socks. Welcome back. If you're still here, that means you're either committed to sock history, or you've already dozed off and your phone is about to slide off the bed onto your face. Either way, let's keep plodding. Tonight's installment takes us through the Industrial Revolution, the World Wars, and the birth of modern socks. Because apparently this saga still has life left in it. Let's rewind to 1589 for a second. William Lee, an English clergyman, invented the stocking frame knitting machine. He wanted to impress Queen Elizabeth I. She wasn't impressed. Apparently, the Queen thought his machine-knit stockings were too coarse compared to her fancy hand-knit silk ones. So William Lee basically wasted years of his life inventing sock technology, only to get roasted by a monarch. That's history in a nutshell. Big dreams, and a royal saying, meh. But the machine didn't vanish. By the 1700s and 1800s, as factories multiplied, sock-making went industrial. Suddenly, stockings weren't just luxury items. They were mass-produced. Cotton, wool, silk, all cranked out by machines, ready to cover the ankles of Britain's growing middle class. You know you've truly industrialized when even socks become boringly abundant. Of course, factories meant child labor. Little kids stuck in textile mills, working the sock machines for 14-hour days, lint filling their lungs, fingers nicked raw. Imagine being 10 years old, never going to school, but becoming intimately familiar with the production cycle of hosiery. A bleak childhood, but hey, great for global sock availability. By the Victorian era, socks were everywhere. They weren't just functional. They were moral. A respectable man wore clean socks. A respectable woman wore stockings that no one could ever see. And of course, etiquette guides made sure to remind everyone about the correct sock protocol. Because nothing says empire at its peak like writing a 300-page guidebook on footwear modesty. Now, let's trudge into the 20th century. The wars, which unfortunately were basically sock horror stories. In World War I, trench warfare meant mud, water, and misery. Soldiers stood in flooded trenches for days, sometimes weeks. Wet socks, wet boots, skin macerating until it peeled off. The result? Trench foot, a condition so nasty that toes turned black, flesh rotted, and amputation became common. And the only prevention? Dry socks. Seriously, armies issued endless reminders. Change your socks, dry your socks, never stop taking care of your socks. Officers would literally inspect men's feet. Imagine being in the middle of shellfire and your sergeant kneels down, glaring at your toes, muttering, "Private, when was the last time you changed your socks?" That was the reality. Not exactly glorious, but historically accurate. World War II, same story. Soldiers still relied on socks, this time with slightly better materials. Wool, cotton, sometimes synthetics like rayon. But shortages hit. Rationing meant socks were precious. Wives and mothers back home knitted comfort socks for soldiers, sending packages across the Atlantic. Knitting patterns were printed in magazines. Sock drives became patriotic duties. So yes, entire war efforts partly ran on the morale-boosting power of socks. Forget tanks, think yarn. Meanwhile, outside the battlefield, civilian fashion took its own path. The 1920s brought shorter skirts for women, meaning stockings were suddenly visible. Cue scandal, cue marketing. Companies sold silk stockings in every shade. Then came nylon. In 1939, DuPont unveiled nylon stockings in America. They were cheap, stretchy, and wildly popular. Women literally lined up outside stores to grab a pair. Socks had gone modern, but wartime rationing struck again. Nylon was redirected to parachutes and ropes. Suddenly, women couldn't get stockings. Some resorted to drawing fake seams down the backs of their legs with eyeliner to create the illusion of stockings. Yes, DIY sock cosplay. Fashion is nothing if not stubborn. Let's wander lazily into the post-war years. By the 1950s, socks were everywhere again. Men wore plain business socks. Women wore nylons. Teenagers wore colorful ankle socks with saddle shoes. Sock hop dances became a thing, named after the fact that kids literally took off their shoes and danced in socks to avoid scuffing gym floors. So yes, the great American cultural revolution of rock and roll partly involved sweaty socks on varnished wood. The 1970s and 80s, of course, gave us tube socks. Long, white, ribbed, often with colored stripes. Gym class required them. Roller disco required them. Movies required them. For some reason, humans decided that calf-high white socks with rainbow stripes were peak athletic chic. Entire generations grew up looking like extras in a budget tennis commercial. And let's not skip the 1990s. Suddenly, socks got ironic. Funky patterns, cartoon characters, bright neons. The more ridiculous, the better. Nothing says 90s rebellion like wearing Bugs Bunny socks under your Doc Martens. Yawning face, which brings us to the modern era, the sock renaissance. Socks, once boring, became quirky statement pieces. Sock subscription boxes arrived, because apparently humans will pay to have colorful cotton delivered monthly to their door. Sock influencers popped up on Instagram, carefully curating ankle aesthetics. And yes, the debate over socks and sandals continues, proving humanity has learned nothing in 2,000 years. Now let's address the great sock conspiracy, the laundry problem, the missing sock phenomenon. Washing machines, since their invention, have somehow eaten socks. Scientists, real scientists, have studied this. The conclusion: socks slip into machine crevices, get lodged in drainage systems, or stick inside duvet covers. But the mystery persists. Somewhere out there is a dimension made entirely of single socks, a sad purgatory of unmatched cotton. Future historians may well call our age the Great Sock Loss. And that, my weary listeners, is where we'll leave part 3. From trench foot to tube socks, from ration nylon to Instagram sockfluencers, we've drifted across the last 2 centuries. And yes, somehow we're still talking about socks. So stretch your legs, wiggle your toes, maybe peek into your laundry basket and wonder how many single socks are lost forever. The saga isn't over yet. In our final stretch, we'll tie all of this together. The cultural symbolism, the strange rituals, and the inevitable boring conclusion that socks are humanity's most underrated obsession. Until then, close your eyes, dream of tube socks, and rest easy knowing history is really just one long mismatched drawer. Hey guys, if you've made it all the way here, congratulations. Or condolences. Either you're very dedicated to the history of socks, or you're trying desperately to fall asleep and my droning has succeeded. Either way, welcome back. Tonight, we finish our 2,000-year journey by floating gently through the cultural side of socks. Rituals, traditions, and the kind of trivia that makes you question your life choices. Let's start with something festive. Christmas stockings. Today, they're oversized red socks you hang by the fireplace. Cute, cozy, a place to dump candy and plastic toys. But the tradition goes back to the legend of Saint Nicholas. Supposedly, a poor man had 3 daughters but no dowries for them, which in that era basically meant a lifetime of misery. Saint Nicholas, being the patron saint of generous rich guys, snuck into their house at night and tossed gold coins into their stockings, which were drying by the fire, conveniently sock-shaped, and so, centuries later, we're still stuffing socks with gifts. The moral? Even saints understood the usefulness of laundry as a delivery system. In Japan, socks became symbolic in a different way. The tabi sock, white, split-toe, worn with sandals, has existed since the 15th century. For samurai and nobles, clean white tabi meant refinement. Today, they're still worn in traditional ceremonies, tea rituals, and by sumo referees. And yes, hipster fashion brands occasionally sell them at ridiculous markups, claiming they align your posture. Which is funny, considering they were invented so you could just slip sandals on without sweating through them. In South Korea, socks have become a quirky gift culture. Streets and subways sell cheap, silly socks, covered in cartoon faces, K-pop idols, even political figures. Teenagers exchange them as tokens of friendship, which means somewhere, right now, someone is walking around with their toes wrapped in a pair of socks featuring Abraham Lincoln winking. Truly global history. Meanwhile, in the West, socks occasionally enter politics. There's something called sock diplomacy. For example, Canada's former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, became semi-famous for wearing colorful, patterned socks to international meetings. Cartoon Chewbacca socks at NATO summits, rainbow pride socks at parades. World leaders shook hands, cameras clicked, and the headlines were about his socks. Proof that in the 21st century, the most powerful tool of soft power may, in fact, be soft fabric. But socks aren't always cheerful. In some cultures, they symbolize status or shame. In the Ottoman Empire, slaves and servants were often given plain wool socks, while elites paraded around in embroidered silk ones. In some European folklore, socks were linked to poverty. Holes in socks, visible in public, marked you as careless or poor. Even today, people still quietly judge others' socks, whether they match, whether they're too flashy, whether you dared to wear white socks with a suit. Social anxiety distilled into cotton tubes. Now let's glide over to the world of rituals and weird traditions. In Scandinavia, there's a custom where university students receive graduation socks. Blue ones for certain programs, red ones for others. Because nothing says, I spent years studying chemistry, like a pair of novelty hosiery that I in Eastern Europe. Weddings sometimes involve sock symbolism. A bride's relatives might gift her socks as a sign of domestic readiness. Romantic, I know. Nothing like spending your honeymoon staring at a pile of knitwear. And in Britain, the House of Commons once had a rule about socks. Male MPs were expected to wear dark, sober socks. Too much flair was frowned upon. It wasn't until relatively recently that more colorful styles snuck in. Democracy apparently requires controlled ankles. Of course, the modern era has made socks into collectibles. Some people hoard rare designer socks. There are luxury brands selling single pairs for over $1,000. Handmade from cashmere, silk, or even vicuña wool. Which is ironic, considering socks have historically been lost, worn out, and generally ignored. But now, they're investments. Imagine explaining to your ancestors that you blew a month's rent on artisanal socks. They'd laugh, then ask if they could borrow a pair. Let's not forget sports. Athletic socks became a field of innovation all on their own. Moisture-wicking fibers, arch support, compression socks for circulation. Basketball players made crew socks iconic. Soccer players stuffed shin guards under theirs. And of course, marathon runners tested the limits of blister prevention. Sports science has poured millions of dollars into sock design. Also, you can sweat slightly more efficiently. And then, the internet did what it always does. Turned socks into memes. Sock puppet accounts used for fake online personas. The eternal joke about socks disappearing in dryers. And that one moment in 2011 when a YouTube video titled Sock Song went mildly viral. Entire digital cultures have formed around something once considered the least exciting clothing item. But here's the thing. If we step back, slowly, sleepily, socks aren't really about fashion. Or even function. They're about being human. Protecting fragile feet. Showing off wealth. Hiding embarrassment. Expressing personality. Socks are simultaneously universal and invisible. Everyone wears them, but no one thinks about them. Except, of course, us right now. 2 hours into this completely unnecessary history lesson. So let's close the drawer. From the first scraps of animal hide tied around cave ankles, to silk stockings in Versailles, to soggy trench socks in the mud, to Instagram influencers modeling pineapple print ankle socks. It's been 2,000 years of threads and toes. A history stitched together, unraveling quietly, never quite finished. And tomorrow morning, when you slip on a mismatched pair, you'll know you're part of that long, boring continuum, which is oddly comforting. So, my tired listener, let's end here. Put your socks on, or take them off if you're under the blankets. Drift into sleep. Dream of laundries of wool and cotton, of forgotten pairs hiding behind dryers. Because in the end, history is just one long, cozy story. Hey again, if you're somehow still here, listening to me talk about socks for what feels like a lifetime, I salute you. Or maybe you're half asleep and your phone is about to slide off the nightstand. Either way, welcome to the final stretch of this saga. Tonight, we're going to shuffle slowly through the less glamorous parts of sock history, laundry, money, and yes, sock philosophy. Because apparently, this is who we are now. Let's begin with laundry. Yes, the eternal cycle. Socks go in. Some socks come out. But not all. Where do the missing ones go? This question has haunted households for decades. Scientific studies, yes, there are actual studies, have tried to solve it. One British survey found that the average person loses about 1.3 socks per month, which equals about 15 socks a year. Over a lifetime, that's more than 1,000 lost socks, which, when multiplied across a nation, adds up to millions of missing socks. An entire phantom army of fabric, swallowed by dryers, eaten by couch cushions, or simply abandoned in gym bags. Historians of the future will have questions. The economics of socks is another sleepy lane. In medieval times, socks were expensive silk, wool, handmade. A single pair could cost more than a laborer's week of wages, which meant you wore them until they literally disintegrated. By the Industrial Revolution, mass production made socks cheap and abundant. Today, socks are one of the most commonly purchased clothing items in the world. Annual sales in the global sock industry are estimated at over $40 billion. That's right, There's a multi-billion-dollar empire built entirely around wrapping your feet in tubes. Who knew your laundry basket was a financial powerhouse? Now let's talk environmental impact. Not exciting, but quietly important. Most modern socks are made with synthetic fibers like polyester or nylon, which means every wash releases microplastics into water systems. Billions of tiny fibers floating around the planet, courtesy of your cozy ankle socks. Wool and cotton, meanwhile, require massive amounts of land and water to produce. So, in a way, socks are part of the environmental story of the 21st century. Your feet may be warm, but somewhere, a river is sighing. And of course, socks inspire philosophy. Yes, philosophy. There's a thought experiment known as the sock problem. If you have a sock with a hole in it and you patch it, is it still the same sock? If you patch it again and again, at what point does it stop being the original sock? It's a cousin of the ship of Theseus paradox, except with fewer sails and more lint. Philosophers have written papers on this, meaning someone somewhere got paid to think deeply about socks. There's also the sock drawer as a metaphor for life. Neat freaks organize their socks by color, folded into perfect pairs. Others toss them into chaos, mismatched and tangled. Some people iron socks. Yes, really. Others barely care if they're wearing the same length. And isn't that just humanity in a nutshell? We're all trying to impose order on small, silly things, while knowing entropy always wins. In literature, socks occasionally sneak in as symbols. In George Orwell's writing, socks and underwear often represented dull, grinding reality. In poetry, socks sometimes stand in for domestic intimacy. Pablo Neruda famously wrote an ode to my socks, describing them as two socks as soft as rabbits, which proves that even great poets sometimes run out of topics. And then there's the sock in space. Astronauts on the International Space Station still wear socks daily, but laundry is impossible. Clothes are worn until they're unbearable, then packed up and incinerated upon re-entry, which means somewhere above Earth, a sock is quietly orbiting, destined for a fiery end. The most boring piece of space history imaginable. So, as we drift toward the close of this extended finale, what have we really learned? Socks are small. Socks are everywhere. They've been currency, fashion, comfort, and annoyance. They disappear, they reappear, they pile up. And if you stare long enough at your sock drawer, you might just realize it's a tiny history book, woven with threads of culture, economy, and human absurdity. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to put you to sleep. So, my friend, as we finally finish this marathon of monotony, let your eyes close. Pull up the blanket. Wiggle your toes, socked or unsocked. And rest easy knowing you've just survived what may be the most boring history lecture ever recorded. Hey again. I know, we already said goodbye. But like that one sock that refuses to leave the dryer drum, we're still here. And tonight, we're going even deeper into the trivial fabric folds of history. So, let's sink slowly into the worlds of laws, manners, medical uses, and, believe it or not, sock museums. Because apparently we can always make socks more boring. First, let's talk about laws. Socks have occasionally made their way into the legal system. In Tudor England, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what fabrics. Rich nobles wore silk hose. Commoners wore wool. If you tried to sneak around these rules, you could be fined. Imagine standing before a court, accused of wearing fancy stockings. The medieval version of a fashion police reality show. In modern times, prisons and schools have had strict sock regulations. White socks only. No logos. Sometimes even ankle-length requirements. A reminder that sometimes authority extends right down to your toes. Now, etiquette. Victorian society, of course, had rules for socks. Men were advised to match their socks to their trousers, never their shoes. Showing bare ankle was considered scandalous. In France, gentlemen carried spare socks when visiting, because sweaty socks were seen as a social offense. Which raises the question, Who was sniffing? Today, sock etiquette lives on in subtle ways. Business culture insists on dark socks. Weddings require coordinated sock colors. And of course, wearing socks with sandals remains an eternal debate. Europeans say yes. Americans say no. The world remains divided. Let's slide into medicine. For centuries, socks weren't just for warmth. They were remedies. In medieval times, onion socks were a cure for fever. You'd put sliced onions in your socks overnight, believing they absorbed illness. Doctors recommended wool socks soaked in vinegar to draw out toxins. By the 19th century, hospitals used flannel socks to prevent chills in tuberculosis patients. Today, we have compression socks, beloved by nurses, athletes, and anyone stuck on a long-haul flight. They prevent swelling and blood clots. Medical catalogs list dozens of varieties: diabetic socks, thermal socks, silver thread antibacterial socks. Humanity has truly invented a sock for every possible complaint. And now, the museums. Yes, sock museums exist. The oldest surviving knitted sock is in the British Museum, dating from 300 to 500 AD Egypt. It has a split toe designed for sandals. There are also historic sock collections in textile museums from Sweden to Japan. In America, there's even a National Sock Memorial Day, December 4th, dedicated to all the socks that mysteriously disappear, which means somewhere, someone has actually stood in front of a glass case, solemnly staring at a sock. Of course, we can't forget sock gifts. For centuries, socks have been the world's most underwhelming present. A running joke at Christmas, but historically useful. In Iceland, children traditionally receive socks during Jólapakafól, the Christmas book flood. In parts of Eastern Europe, handmade socks were a sign of devotion. Today, novelty socks are an entire industry: taco socks, cat socks, Shakespeare quote socks. Proof that boredom and consumerism are best friends. So, as we finally drag the story through laws, manners, medicine, and museums, what's left? Not much. Just a quiet reflection that even the smallest thing we take for granted has been shaped by culture, ritual, and time. A sock is never just a sock. It's history stitched around your foot. But more importantly, it's also the perfect lullaby. Because if you're still awake after all this, then you, my friend, are unstoppable. So close your eyes one more time. Let the silence settle. And let the story of socks finally fade away. Hey again. Still awake? That's brave. Tonight, we're trudging into the battlefields of history. Not with swords or cannons, but with socks. Because even in times of war, someone had to worry about cold toes. Let's start with the Romans. Legionnaires wore sandals, of course, but by the colder campaigns in Northern Europe, many layered them with crude wool socks. Imagine trying to conquer Gaul while slipping around in soggy wool foot wraps. Ancient sources barely mention this detail because why would they? But archaeologists have found sock remnants near forts. So yes, Rome marched on its stomach and its socks. Fast forward to the Napoleonic Wars. Soldiers often lacked proper footwear. Letters from troops complain more about holes in socks than enemy fire. In fact, women back home were constantly knitting socks to send to the front lines. Entire communities organized sock drives. A truly thrilling image, armies clashing across Europe, fueled by parcels of scratchy wool socks that end the American Civil War. Socks became a political issue. Soldiers' diaries mention them endlessly. Union troops sometimes received shipments of socks with notes tucked inside. Little love letters from strangers. Confederate soldiers, meanwhile, relied on mothers and sisters knitting late into the night. One Confederate general supposedly declared that the victory belongs to the side with more socks. Not quite as inspiring as liberty or death, but practical. Then came the World Wars. Socks went industrial. Knitting for soldiers was promoted as patriotic duty. Posters urged women, "Our boys need socks." Some campaigns even demanded seamless socks because seams caused blisters in trenches. The Red Cross organized sock knitting circles. Millions of pairs were shipped overseas. In Britain, during World War II, wool rationing created shortages. People unraveled old sweaters to reknit them into socks. In Germany, propaganda encouraged citizens to mend, don't spend, including socks. Somewhere in the ruins of Berlin, someone was still darning. And yes, socks sometimes failed catastrophically. Soldiers in the Korean War and Vietnam faced trench foot, a condition caused by wet, dirty socks. Military manuals literally ordered, change socks daily, keep them dry, inspect your buddy's feet. Somewhere in a jungle, a soldier's life hinged on clean socks. Politics wasn't immune either. In the 1980s, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was rumored to critique her minister's socks. Dark and conservative were mandatory. Across the ocean, President George H.W. Bush developed a reputation for colorful socks, a tradition carried proudly by his son. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau once wore sandals with socks to Parliament, scandalizing an entire generation of reporters. But perhaps the strangest example comes from South Africa in the early 1990s. Nelson Mandela was known for his bright, patterned shirts, but he also had a fondness for quirky socks. At one point, a South African newspaper ran an article about Mandela's socks diplomacy, noting how his playful footwear symbolized warmth in tense negotiations. Imagine world peace, stitched at the ankle. Of course, revolutions had their sock moments too. In 18th century France, aristocrats wore silk stockings, while revolutionaries favored rough wool. Stockings literally became political. To wear silk after 1789 could mark you as a monarchist. The guillotine probably didn't care, but fashion certainly did. So here we are, from Roman sandals with wool inserts to modern armies with entire logistics departments devoted to socks. War has always marched hand in foot, or rather foot in sock. It's not glorious, it's not heroic, it's slightly damp, and very, very boring, perfect for bedtime.
Hey friends, welcome back. Hopefully you're cozy, maybe under a blanket, maybe even wearing a pair of socks yourself. Tonight, we're wandering into culture's attic, where dusty paintings, old books, and religious rituals somehow manage to involve socks. It's a long, slow walk, so let's just drift along together. First stop, ancient art. In Egypt, socks occasionally appear on painted pottery, usually tucked under sandals. Archaeologists have found brightly dyed socks in children's tombs, sometimes split-toe style, like early Tabi. Imagine being buried thousands of years ago, only to be remembered mainly for your footwear. A strange kind of immortality. Greek and Roman art rarely shows socks, probably because bare feet or sandals were considered more dignified. But traces do slip in. Some statues of northern soldiers hint at wrapped feet beneath boots, although sculptors weren't exactly interested in glorifying soggy wool. Understandably, now literature, socks have shuffled through pages for centuries. In medieval romances, knights sometimes received gifts of embroidered stockings from their ladies. These weren't romantic so much as practical, because nothing says love like, "Please keep your feet warm" in chainmail. By the Renaissance, socks and stockings were practically poetry. Shakespeare mentions stockings in several plays. In Twelfth Night, Malvolio dreams of impressing his mistress by wearing yellow stockings, cross-gartered. Of course, this was supposed to look ridiculous. Imagine showing up to work tomorrow in fluorescent striped socks. The reaction would be about the same. Later writers used socks as shorthand for dull domesticity. Charles Dickens casually references socks as things always needing mending. Jane Austen's characters notice whether a gentleman's stockings are clean. It's hard to picture Mr. Darcy in a sock crisis, but the possibility was there. In the 20th century, socks became comedy props. From Dr. Seuss's Fox in Socks to endless sitcom jokes about lost laundry. Even Samuel Beckett once wrote about boots and shoes in his bleak plays, hinting at humanity's endless shuffle. If socks are absent, you can still feel their ghost lurking. Religion wasn't exempt. In Islam, for example, there are detailed rulings about wiping over socks during ritual ablution. Debates raged for centuries. Did the Prophet mean leather socks, cloth socks, or something else? Scholars wrote pages upon pages, all to clarify if you could keep your feet covered while praying. It's one of history's most unexpectedly foot-focused theological disputes. In Christianity, socks mostly appear in the form of silk stockings worn by priests and bishops in liturgical dress. Cardinals were famous for their scarlet silk hosiery, bright enough to announce rank even under heavy robes. Meanwhile, ordinary monks wore scratchy wool socks, which probably added to the whole aura of suffering. Hindu traditions emphasize bare feet in temples, so socks rarely appear, except as something you definitely don't wear inside sacred space. Shoes and socks stay outside, leaving devotees to tread softly on stone floors. In that way, socks became a kind of invisible boundary, marking the line between everyday life and spiritual ritual. And of course, we can't forget socks in visual art. In 17th century Dutch paintings, stockings often appear drying by fireplaces. Symbolic? Maybe. Or maybe just a reminder that laundry existed even in the golden age of painting. In Japanese ukiyo-e prints, tabi socks feature prominently, white and pristine, signaling refinement. Samurai, geisha, even kabuki actors, everyone was judged by the whiteness of their socks. No pressure. In modern art, socks get surreal. Salvador Dali once sketched himself wearing mismatched socks, apparently to confuse time. Andy Warhol collected hundreds of pairs, many of which are now archived in museums. Imagine a curator carefully cataloging 40-year-old polyester socks. That's someone's career. So, across centuries, socks shuffled quietly into art, slipped into literature, and even tangled themselves in theology. Not glamorous, not earth-shaking, but persistent, like a faint thread weaving its way through culture's tapestry. And now, as your eyelids grow heavy, you might realize you've just listened to 10 minutes about socks in paintings and prayers, which is exactly the kind of sleepy trivia that history is best at. Hey friends, settle back, stretch your toes, maybe wiggle them under a blanket. Tonight we're stepping into the 18th and 19th centuries, the period where socks went from being practical warmers to full-scale obsessions. And yes, we are about to spend a long, boring while talking about how the Industrial Revolution gave birth to your sock drawer. First things first, early modern Europe. By the 1700s, stockings were already major players in fashion. Men, especially in France, showed off long silk stockings with breeches. The smoother and shinier, the better. Louis XIV loved his legs so much he practically turned stockings into personal billboards. Portraits show him propping a foot on a cushion, legs stretched, silk sock gleaming. Subtlety wasn't really his thing. Meanwhile, women wore stockings too, but usually hidden under long skirts. They weren't considered stylish so much as necessary, which meant men's socks were flashy, women's socks were practical, and somewhere in there, entire guilds of weavers made a living. Then came the Industrial Revolution and socks got mechanized. Knitting frames, spinning jennies, and eventually full-blown machines churned out stockings at a rate no hand knitter could match. Suddenly, even ordinary workers could afford cotton socks. Before this, peasants often just wrapped rags around their feet. Now they could buy a pair. Progress one blister at a time. Factories cranked out socks in different fibers: wool, cotton, silk, and increasingly blends. Regional towns became sock capitals. Nottingham, in England, was basically a sock hub. The city was dotted with workshops where families operated knitting frames, often crammed into tiny rooms. It was tedious, repetitive work. People literally toiled for 14 hours a day so someone else could have warm toes. Of course, fashion rules kept shifting. By the late 18th century, men abandoned breeches for trousers. Suddenly, stockings weren't flashy accessories anymore. They were hidden. Men's socks shrank to ankle height, destined for invisibility. Meanwhile, women's hosiery grew more important, especially with lighter dresses in the 19th century. Cotton stockings became everyday wear. Silk was still luxury, saved for parties and portraits. Somewhere in this period, the sock began its slow crawl toward capitalist branding. Shops advertised durable socks, fashionable colors, or imported silks. Magazines showed drawings of ideal stockings. Even the concept of gifting socks at Christmas crept in, merging practicality with tradition. Parents everywhere thought, perfect, something boring but useful, and the tradition never died. In America, socks tied into the frontier myth. Settlers heading west stuffed wool socks into wagons alongside rifles and flour. General stores stocked bulk socks in barrels, often mismatched, often scratchy. They were cheap, rough, and designed to wear out. Industrial capitalism thrived on the fact that socks had short lifespans. They unraveled, they tore, and you had to buy more. Planned obsolescence, centuries before smartphones. Now, let's not forget the sock police of the Victorian era. Etiquette books went on and on about proper hosiery. A gentleman's socks had to match his trousers. Ladies' stockings had to be spotless and usually white, which was impractical but ladylike. And then came garters, elastic bands, or ribbons that held socks up. Without garters, stockings would slowly slouch down the leg, which was considered scandalous. Imagine fainting couches being used because someone's sock slipped. Victorians even moralized about socks. A tidy sock drawer symbolized virtue and order. Holes in socks meant laziness. Housewives were judged on their darning skills. Marriage advice guides sometimes literally suggested, watch how he keeps his socks. It reflects his character. If you've ever been nagged about laundry, congratulations, you're part of a 200-year-old tradition. By the late 19th century, socks went international. Cotton socks flooded markets in Asia and Africa. Missionaries handed them out as civilized clothing. Soldiers in colonial armies marched in regulation socks. Globalization, one sweaty boot at a time. And just like that, socks had become an entire industry. No longer just hand-knit tokens or symbols of nobility. They were mass-produced, standardized, marketed, moralized, and globalized. Basically, they had entered modern life fully. So, we've gone from Louis XIV showing off his silky calves, to factory workers in Nottingham knitting socks until their hands cramped, to Victorian households fretting about garters. A long, slow arc of fashion, labor, and capitalism. All for a piece of cloth around your ankle. As you drift off tonight, just remember, every time you open your sock drawer, you're basically staring at 300 years of industrial history, which is maybe not exciting, but definitely long enough to put anyone to sleep. So, the year is 1938. The world is teetering on the edge of chaos, but DuPont, yes, the chemical company, drops a new invention. Nylon. A synthetic fiber that didn't come from sheep, silkworms, or plants. Came from laboratories, and it was durable, stretchy, and smooth. At first, nylon went straight into women's stockings. Glossy, sheer hosiery became the hottest commodity in America. Women lined up outside stores when new shipments arrived. Ads bragged about nylons that wouldn't sag or wrinkle, making every calf look flawless. Sock marketing had officially entered the age of science. Then came World War II, and suddenly nylon wasn't for legs, it was for parachutes and rope. Stockings disappeared. Women had to improvise. Some painted seams down the backs of their legs to fake the look of nylons. Imagine dragging a pencil across your calf just to look socially acceptable. That's wartime fashion for you. Meanwhile, soldiers needed socks. Lots of them. Military supply chains pumped out wool socks by the millions. Troops in Europe froze if socks got wet. Letters from home often included hand-knit pairs. Whole communities were mobilized to knit socks for our boys. Imagine an entire national war effort focused partly on preventing trench foot. After the war, nylon came roaring back. Stockings hit department store shelves again, and advertising doubled down. Nylon wasn't just fabric. It was modernity itself. Smooth, sleek, efficient. Housewives were bombarded with sock commercials. Glossy magazine spreads featured smiling women in spotless hose, usually paired with awkward captions like, "Because your legs deserve science." At the same time, men's socks settled into a predictable role. Short, ribbed, boring. Businessmen wore dark cotton socks, always matched to trousers. The only variation was argyle, which popped up in golf culture. Argyle socks whispered, "Yes, I have money and free time to swing a stick at balls. Everyone else stayed in sober, predictable shades. And then came the 1960s and 70s. A psychedelic rainbow of socks appeared. Bright colors, wild patterns, knee-high athletic socks with stripes.